My name is Ben Taylor. I'm 44 years old, and until last winter, I genuinely believed that if you worked harder than everyone else, solved problems nobody else could solve, and never let your team down, the company would eventually recognize your value. I wasn't chasing promotions. I wasn't trying to become an executive. I never cared about having the biggest office or the fanciest title. All I wanted was to build a career I could be proud of and provide a stable life for my family. It took me 19 years to understand that loyalty and recognition are not the same thing. For almost 2 decades, I worked as a production coordinator at a manufacturing plant outside Indianapolis. We built commercial HVAC equipment for hospitals, schools, office towers, and factories across the Midwest. Every delayed shipment meant construction projects slowed down, contractors lost money, and customers demanded answers. That pressure landed on people like me. My alarm went off every weekday at 4:45 in the morning. By 5:40, I was already walking through the employee entrance with a cup of black coffee that almost always became cold before I had time to finish it. Most managers arrived around 7. The production floor was already alive when I got there. Forklifts moved pallets across the warehouse. Maintenance crews inspected equipment. Operators prepared machines for another 12-hour shift. Before most people even opened their laptops, I had usually solved 2 or 3 problems. Officially, my title was production coordinator. Unofficially, I became the person everyone depended on. If raw materials didn't arrive on time, someone called me. If a machine unexpectedly stopped in the middle of a large production run, someone called me. If engineering changed specifications at the last minute, my phone rang. If shipping missed a deadline, people came looking for me. Sometimes I joke that my actual job description should have been whatever nobody else wants to deal with. The joke wasn't far from reality. After 19 years, I knew every corner of that factory. I knew which press machine overheated whenever temperatures climbed above 90 degrees. I knew which suppliers consistently delivered 2 days late despite promising overnight shipping. I knew which maintenance requests had been postponed so many times that temporary repairs had quietly become permanent solutions. You don't learn those things in training manuals. You learn them by showing up every day for nearly 20 years. Our plant employed around 300 people. Every department had a manager: production, engineering, purchasing, quality control, shipping, maintenance. Each department held meetings almost every day. Somehow, every one of those meetings created new tasks for the people who weren't invited. I rarely complained. Back then, I actually enjoyed solving complicated problems. There was something satisfying about walking onto the production floor during complete chaos and leaving an hour later with everything running smoothly again. The operators appreciated it. The supervisors appreciated it. Even the maintenance technicians respected experience. Management appreciated results. Those aren't always the same thing. My direct manager was Kevin Morris. Kevin was 33. He had earned an MBA, spoke confidently during presentations, and always seemed comfortable around executives. He knew every corporate buzzword imaginable: operational excellence, strategic initiatives, process optimization, leadership alignment. Senior management loved listening to him. The employees actually building the products rarely saw him outside meetings. Whenever executives toured the plant, Kevin walked beside them explaining production metrics displayed on large monitors. Meanwhile, I stayed on the factory floor making sure those numbers actually remained accurate. For years, that arrangement seemed to work. I never questioned it. Until the company announced its biggest expansion in over a decade. Business was booming. Corporate celebrated record revenue. Customers placed more orders than we could comfortably produce. Everyone expected exciting opportunities. The employees who had worked there long enough understood what expansion usually meant. Higher expectations, longer hours, more responsibility, without enough additional people. One Monday morning, the entire plant gathered inside the cafeteria before first shift. The plant director stood in front of a massive presentation screen covered with colorful graphs. "Our future has never been stronger," he announced confidently. "We want to recognize employees who demonstrate exceptional commitment during this exciting period of growth." The word recognize echoed through the room. People exchanged quick glances. Nobody asked questions. Everyone wondered the same thing. What exactly did recognition mean? Raises? Bonuses? Promotions? During the following week, human resources scheduled private meetings across every department. Managers disappeared behind closed conference room doors. Some returned smiling. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Nobody discussed numbers openly. Companies always pretend employees don't compare compensation. Reality has never worked that way. Late Thursday afternoon, Kevin stopped by my office carrying a folder. He looked unusually relaxed. "I guess corporate finally knows how to reward leadership," he said with a grin. "Congratulations," I answered sincerely. He thanked me before heading upstairs. About an hour later, I received an email. Mandatory meeting. Friday, 9:30 a.m. Human Resources Conference Room. The meeting lasted barely 15 minutes. The HR manager smiled warmly before saying exactly what I had heard countless times throughout my career. "Ben, we truly appreciate everything you've done for this company." She thanked me for my loyalty, my flexibility, my commitment, my willingness to solve problems outside my responsibilities. She called me one of the company's most dependable employees. Then she offered me a retention bonus. $5,000. Before taxes. I smiled politely, shook everyone's hand, said thank you, walked back to my office, closed the door. Something felt wrong. Not because $5,000 wasn't useful, because the speech had lasted longer than the offer. Whenever a company spends 10 minutes explaining how valuable you are, the number that follows usually tells a different story. Later that afternoon, purely by accident, I discovered Kevin's retention package. He hadn't shown it to me. He hadn't bragged. Someone from finance accidentally attached the wrong compensation sheet to a production report waiting on my desk. I noticed the figure immediately. $35,000. I stared at the document for several silent seconds before closing it. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly, I was confused. Kevin had been with the company for 6 years. I'd spent 19. He managed presentations. I managed emergencies. He reported production numbers. I kept production alive. Yet somehow the company believed his future was worth 7 times more than mine. That evening, I drove home without turning on the radio. Normally, I listened to sports during the 40-minute drive. That day, the truck stayed completely silent. When I walked through the front door, my wife, Melissa, looked at me for less than 5 seconds before asking, "What happened?" I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked one question I couldn't answer. "If you stopped fixing everyone's problems tomorrow, what would happen to that factory?" I laughed quietly. "It would probably fall apart." She looked directly at me. "Then why are they paying someone else like he's the one holding it together?" For the first time in nearly 20 years. I didn't have an answer. I simply sat there wondering whether the company truly valued my experience, or whether they had just become comfortable believing Ben Taylor would always say yes, no matter how little they gave him in return. The following Monday felt exactly like every other Monday, at least on the surface. The production schedule was already behind before the first shift officially started. One supplier had missed a delivery window because of an accident on Interstate 70. Another shipment arrived with damaged electrical components. Purchasing blamed the supplier. The supplier blamed the freight company. Production blamed purchasing. Everyone blamed everyone else. Meanwhile, the assembly lines were running out of parts. Kevin walked into my office carrying his tablet. "Morning, Ben." "Morning. We've got a situation." I noticed. He smiled. "I knew you would." Those 6 words used to make me proud. Now they bothered me. Not because they were rude, because they had quietly become an expectation. Within 20 minutes, I had already called 2 backup suppliers, rearranged the production schedule, moved one assembly line to a different product, and convinced shipping to delay 2 outbound trailers until replacement parts arrived. It wasn't perfect, but it kept the factory moving. By lunch, we had recovered almost everything. Later that afternoon, the plant director congratulated management for excellent coordination during an unexpected supply chain disruption. Kevin received most of the praise. I received another assignment. That seemed to happen a lot. The more problems I solved, the more new responsibilities appeared. About 2 weeks later, the company announced another increase in production. Demand had grown again. Corporate celebrated another record quarter. The email described it as an exciting opportunity. The people on the factory floor translated it differently. More overtime, more pressure, no additional employees. Within 3 weeks, our daily production targets increased nearly 20%. Staffing didn't increase at all. The dependable people simply worked harder. The unreliable ones somehow disappeared whenever difficult jobs needed to be done. One Thursday afternoon, I walked through assembly line 3. Something immediately felt wrong. Operators kept stopping every few minutes. Materials weren't arriving fast enough. Forklifts waited in line. Finished units couldn't move into packaging because the warehouse was already full. Everything looked busy. Very little was actually getting done. I spent half an hour watching without saying a word. Sometimes the fastest way to understand a problem is simply to observe it. The issue wasn't the employees. It wasn't the machines. It was scheduling. Engineering had changed the build sequence without informing production. That forced operators to switch tools almost every 20 minutes. Each changeover wasted 8 or 9 minutes. 8 minutes doesn't sound important. Multiply that by 30 changeovers every shift. Then multiply that across 5 production lines. By the end of the week, we had lost almost an entire day's worth of production. I wrote a detailed report explaining the problem. Included data. Included recommendations. Included a revised schedule that would eliminate most of the downtime. Kevin thanked me. This is excellent work. The following Tuesday, he presented my recommendations during the weekly executive meeting. I know because one of the supervisors sent me a picture afterward. My charts were displayed on the projector. My production flow diagram filled the screen. Kevin stood beside it explaining his strategy. My name appeared nowhere. I stared at the photo for almost a minute before locking my phone. Oddly enough, I wasn't even surprised anymore. That Friday, another problem landed on my desk. Quality control rejected nearly 400 finished compressor units. One measurement exceeded tolerance by less than a millimeter. Technically, they couldn't be shipped. Engineering insisted the specifications were correct. Production insisted the machines hadn't changed. Quality refused to release the order. Meanwhile, a customer expected delivery the following morning. Everyone gathered inside the conference room. Managers debated procedures, policies, documentation, possible liability. After 20 minutes, they still hadn't inspected a single part. I left the meeting without saying anything. Walked directly to the production floor. Asked one operator to stop his machine. Measured 10 randomly selected components myself. Then checked the calibration records. The answer appeared almost immediately. Nothing was wrong with production. Nothing was wrong with engineering. One inspection gauge had been dropped during the previous shift. It was reading slightly off. Every rejected unit actually met specifications. Replacing the damaged gauge took less than 5 minutes. The shipment left on time. The customer never knew there had been a problem. That afternoon, Kevin stopped by my office. Nice catch. It wasn't complicated. He laughed. Maybe not for you. Then he said something I had heard hundreds of times over the years. I honestly don't know what we'd do without you. A year earlier, that sentence would have made me smile. Now, it sounded different. If the company truly couldn't operate without me, why was I the one constantly proving my value? Why wasn't the company proving mine? The question stayed in my head for weeks. October arrived. That meant annual preventive maintenance. Normally, each production line shut down one at a time. This year, management decided something different. Corporate wanted every machine available for production. Maintenance would be delayed until after year-end. The maintenance manager argued against it. So did I. Several machines were already showing signs of wear. Bearings needed replacing. Hydraulic seals were leaking. Electrical panels required inspection. We both documented everything. Management thanked us for our concerns, then approved the delay anyway. Exactly 12 days later, Machine 14 suffered a complete hydraulic failure. Production stopped immediately. Oil covered part of the assembly area. The repair lasted almost 16 hours. The downtime cost far more than the preventive maintenance would have. Nobody mentioned the earlier warnings. Nobody admitted the decision had been a mistake. Instead, another emergency meeting was scheduled. Kevin looked exhausted. Corporate wanted explanations. The plant director wanted hourly updates. Finance wanted revised production forecasts. Everyone suddenly needed reports. Nobody asked who had predicted the failure. Late that evening, while mechanics continued repairing the machine, I walked across the quiet production floor. Most employees had already gone home. Only maintenance remained. One of the senior technicians sat on an overturned toolbox drinking coffee. He had worked there even longer than I had. Without looking up, he asked, "You ever think about leaving?" I smiled. "Sometimes." He nodded slowly. "I used to think this place couldn't survive without people like us." "You don't anymore?" He took another sip of coffee. "No." "What changed?" "The company always survives." He looked around the empty factory. "The question is whether you do." I didn't answer, because deep down, I was beginning to wonder if he was right. By the beginning of November, I had stopped expecting things to improve. The workload kept growing. The staffing shortages never disappeared. Every week, another experienced employee handed in a resignation. Corporate called it normal turnover. The people working on the production floor called it burnout. There was a difference. One Monday morning, I walked into the plant and immediately noticed something unusual. The parking lot was almost full before sunrise. Temporary workers, at least 20 of them. Some had never worked inside a manufacturing plant before. Most had received less than 2 hours of training. Management celebrated the decision. We've solved the staffing problem. No, they had solved the headcount problem. Those are not the same thing. By the end of the first week, experienced operators spent more time teaching than producing. Mistakes increased. Materials were misplaced. Finished units failed inspection. Production slowed instead of improving. Every delay created another meeting. Every meeting ended with another request for me. Ben, can you reorganize line 2? Ben, can you train the new supervisors? Ben, can you look over this production schedule? Ben, could you stay a few extra hours? I rarely said no. Mostly because saying no meant someone else on the floor would pay the price. Not management. The operators. The mechanics. The shipping crew. The people actually building the products. One Wednesday afternoon, Kevin walked into my office carrying a stack of reports. We've got a visit from corporate next week. I nodded. I heard. They want everything looking perfect. I almost laughed. Perfect. The factory wasn't supposed to look perfect. It was supposed to run efficiently. Those aren't always the same thing. They're especially interested in productivity numbers, Kevin continued. I'll make sure the lines stay running. He hesitated. And maybe avoid mentioning the maintenance backlog. I looked up. What? They don't need every detail. They asked for the truth. They need confidence. That sentence stayed with me long after he left. Confidence. Not accuracy. Not solutions. Confidence. The following Tuesday, the executives arrived. Fresh suits. Clean shoes. Perfect smiles. They spent most of their visit inside conference rooms. When they finally walked onto the production floor, every supervisor suddenly became unusually visible. Machines that normally needed repairs had been temporarily patched. Old pallets had disappeared. Overtime employees had been told to smile. For 1 hour, the factory looked exactly the way corporate wanted it to look. An hour after they left, everything returned to normal. That Friday, the biggest problem of my career began with something unbelievably small. A sensor failed. One inexpensive sensor. Less than $100 part. Without it, one automated welding cell shut down. Normally that wouldn't have been a disaster. Except the spare sensor had never been ordered. Purchasing assumed maintenance had one. Maintenance assumed purchasing had ordered one. Nobody had verified either assumption. Production stopped. Within 45 minutes, 3 assembly lines had no components to build. Forklift drivers stood waiting. Operators cleaned equipment that was already clean. Everyone looked toward management. Management looked toward me. Kevin hurried across the floor. Ben, I know. How long? I don't know yet. Corporate immediately started requesting updates. Finance wanted estimated losses. Sales wanted delivery forecasts. Customer service wanted explanations. Nobody had the only thing that mattered. The replacement part. I spent nearly 2 hours calling suppliers. Every warehouse within 3 states. Finally, a distributor in Louisville had one in stock. The problem? They closed in 30 minutes. Without waiting for approval, I grabbed the company truck and started driving. 2.5 hours each way. Nearly 5 hours on the road. I arrived just before they locked the doors. The employee behind the counter smiled. You must be Ben. I am. We've been expecting you. I signed the paperwork. Picked up the sensor. Started driving back immediately. By the time I returned, it was almost 9 that night. The maintenance crew installed the new part in less than 20 minutes. Production restarted. The customer never knew anything had happened. The next morning, the plant director congratulated the leadership team for responding quickly. Kevin received another round of compliments. Nobody mentioned the 6-hour drive. Nobody mentioned who actually found the part. I didn't expect applause, but I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Every crisis disappeared before reaching corporate, because people like me quietly absorbed the impact. The better we performed, the less visible our work became. That weekend, my daughter Emily celebrated her 16th birthday. For the first time in months, I promised myself I wouldn't answer work calls. Melissa noticed. You finally turned your phone off. I needed one day. Emily had invited several friends over. The house was full of laughter, music, birthday decorations. For a few hours, work didn't exist. Then my phone vibrated. I ignored it. 30 seconds later, it rang again. Then again. 5 missed calls. 3 text messages. Kevin. I stared at the screen. Melissa gently placed her hand over the phone. You already made your choice. I know. So don't undo it. I left the phone on the kitchen counter. For the next 3 hours, I was simply a father, not a production coordinator, not the guy everyone depended on, just dad. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I finally checked my messages. The emergency? A supervisor had approved the wrong production schedule. The mistake delayed one customer shipment by 4 hours. That was all. Something any supervisor should have been able to solve. Instead, 5 different people tried calling me. Not because the problem was impossible, because nobody had been taught to make decisions without me. I sat alone on the back porch long after everyone else had gone to bed. For 19 years, I believed I had built an efficient operation. Now I realized something uncomfortable. I hadn't built an efficient operation. I had become the operation. And if one person missing for a single afternoon created panic, then the company hadn't created strength. It had created dependence. For the first time since joining the plant, I opened my laptop, not to check production reports, not to answer emails. I updated my resume. It took less than an hour. Closing the file felt strangely emotional. Not because I had decided to leave, because for the first time, leaving no longer felt impossible. The next morning, I printed my resume. Not because I planned to quit, because I wanted to remind myself that I still had a choice. For 19 years, I had convinced myself that leaving wasn't realistic. I had a mortgage, a daughter preparing for college, a son who had just started high school, health insurance, retirement savings, every practical reason to stay exactly where I was. But another thought kept growing louder. If I stayed another 10 years, would anything actually change? Monday answered that question faster than I expected. At 8:15 that morning, Kevin asked me to join a meeting with Human Resources and the plant director. There was no agenda, no explanation, just another calendar invitation. I walked into the conference room carrying a notebook. Kevin smiled. The plant director thanked me for coming. The HR manager folded her hands on the table. Ben, we've completed our organizational review. I nodded. As part of our growth strategy, we're restructuring several leadership positions. I had heard those words before. Growth strategy, restructuring, organizational review. Corporate language rarely improved anyone's day. The plant director slid a packet across the table. We'd like you to take on additional responsibilities. I opened the folder. My job would now include supervising 2 production departments instead of 1, overseeing inventory planning, training new supervisors, reviewing weekly performance reports, leading continuous improvement meetings, coordinating emergency maintenance during weekends, supporting another facility 40 miles away whenever necessary. I kept turning pages. The list continued. Eventually I looked up. Who's taking over my current responsibilities? Kevin answered without hesitation. We believe you can manage both. I already work 60 hours most weeks. We know. Will there be another coordinator? No. Additional supervisors? No. Administrative support? Again, no. I closed the folder. What about compensation? The HR manager smiled politely. Your salary will remain the same. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, the plant director leaned forward. Ben, this shows how much confidence we have in your abilities. Confidence. There was that word again. I had heard it for years. Confidence never seemed to come with additional resources or additional pay, only additional work. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Kevin caught up with me in the hallway. I know this feels like a lot. It is a lot. But this could be your opportunity. I stopped walking. My opportunity for what? To prove you're ready for senior leadership. I looked at him for a long moment. I've been proving that for 19 years. He didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer. Over the next 3 weeks, nothing improved. I traveled between facilities almost every day, solved production issues in one plant before driving to another, answered emails during lunch, returned phone calls while sitting in parking lots. By Friday evenings, I was too exhausted to enjoy the weekends I barely had. Then something happened that finally forced me to make a decision. It was the week before Christmas. A snowstorm hit central Indiana overnight. Several highways closed. Suppliers couldn't reach us. Finished shipments couldn't leave. By 9 in the morning, trucks were lined up outside the plant waiting for loading docks. Inside the factory, raw materials were piling up faster than employees could move them. Every department called an emergency meeting. Corporate executives joined by video. Questions filled the conference room. How long will recovery take? When will production return to schedule? Can we guarantee customer deliveries? Everyone wanted answers. Almost nobody walked onto the production floor. I stood up. We don't have time for another meeting. The room became quiet. The plant director frowned. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we start moving freight instead of talking about it. Without waiting for permission, I left the conference room. Several supervisors followed me. So did the maintenance manager. For the next 9 hours, we worked alongside operators. We unloaded trucks, moved inventory, redirected production, helped forklift drivers clear blocked aisles, reorganized storage locations, made decisions immediately instead of discussing them for 30 minutes. By midnight, most of the backlog was gone. Production had stabilized. Shipping was operating again. Customers never realized how close we had come to missing dozens of deliveries. The following morning, I received another meeting invitation. This time the mood felt different. The plant director looked frustrated. Corporate had reviewed the previous day's events. You failed to provide executive updates during the emergency. I was busy preventing the emergency from getting worse. The executives needed information. The production floor needed leadership. The room fell silent. One executive finally spoke through the video screen. Leadership requires communication. I nodded. It also requires being where the problem actually exists. Nobody interrupted. I continued. For years, we've spent more time reporting problems than preventing them. Another silence. Then the meeting ended with the usual promise. We'll discuss improvements after the holidays. I walked back to my office, sat down, opened my laptop, and submitted my resignation. Not because another company had offered me a better position. Not because I had a perfect plan. Because I finally understood something that had taken 19 years to learn. The company wasn't asking me to build a better operation. It was asking me to sacrifice more of my life to protect a broken one. My notice surprised everyone. Kevin came into my office that afternoon. I thought you'd retire here. So did I. We can work something out. I smiled. You've had 19 years. For the first time since we'd worked together. He had nothing to say. My final month passed quietly. I documented every procedure, trained every supervisor willing to learn, shared every spreadsheet, every checklist, every production guide I had created over the years. I wasn't leaving to make their lives harder. I simply refused to keep living the way I had. About 3 months after my last day, one of my former coworkers called. We talked for almost an hour. Eventually he laughed. You won't believe what's happened. What? They hired 2 coordinators. I smiled. Good. They're still struggling. Why? Because they're looking for another Ben Taylor. I looked out the window for several seconds before answering. They don't need another Ben Taylor. They need a system that doesn't depend on one person. He laughed quietly. I wish management understood that. So do I. Sometimes people ask whether I regret leaving without another job already waiting for me. The honest answer is no. Finding new work wasn't easy. The months afterward were stressful. There were moments when I questioned my decision. Moments when I wondered if I had made the biggest mistake of my career. But then I remembered the birthdays I almost missed. The weekends interrupted by phone calls. The family dinners spent answering work emails. The promises I broke because the factory always seemed more urgent than my own life. No paycheck was worth repeating that cycle. If there's one lesson I hope someone takes from my story, it's this. Being dependable is something to be proud of. Being responsible is a strength. Working hard matters. But when a company rewards your willingness to sacrifice by asking for even more, without respect, without support, without recognizing your value, that's no longer loyalty. That's dependence disguised as appreciation. And sooner or later, you have to decide whether you're building a career or slowly giving it away.